The music felt like a creature of gilded surfaces. It bounced from the crystal chandeliers of Lady Danbury's ballroom, slid across the polished parquet floor, and caught in the diamonds glittering on 100 throats. But for Frances Channing the sound was muffled, a distant echo from the bottom of a well. She stood near a silk-draped pillar, the quiet refuge of the overlooked. It was a role she had perfected over 3 London seasons. She was not plain precisely, but she possessed a certain quietude that the roaring peacock-hued society of the ton simply did not understand. Her gown of pale gray silk marked her presence without participation, a shade that begged for no attention, the very color of invisibility. From this vantage point she watched her mother, Lady Henrietta Channing, holding court near the refreshments. Her mother was all vibrant color and sharp, brilliant laughter, a stark contrast to Frances. Lady Henrietta's smiles were weapons, and her eyes, though identical to Frances's in shape and color, were constantly scanning the room, assessing and calculating. Tonight they fixed with predatory intent on Lord Merivale, a man whose fortune was as vast as his character was shallow. Every so often those cold eyes flicked toward Frances, carrying a silent command. Be charming, be visible, be valuable. Frances felt a cold dread coil in her stomach and turned away her gaze, drifting toward the tall French windows that opened to the damp London night. That was when she saw him. He was no guest. He belonged to the city's vast unseen machinery, a laborer, judging by his worn coat and sturdy boots, tasked with some late-night errand in the mews behind the mansion. He stood under the yellow splash of a gas lamp, his face caught between shadow and light. He was not looking at the glittering ballroom. His attention was fixed entirely on a small, scruffy dog nosing through the gutter. It was limping its tail, a pathetic comma against the cobblestones. As Frances watched, the man knelt. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, as if his joints ached. He reached into his coat, broke off a piece of a small loaf, and held it out on his open palm. He did not toss it. He waited patient and still until the little dog summoned its courage and crept forward. The man did not pet the creature. He simply watched it eat, his head slightly bowed. In that quiet gesture, Frances felt a sudden shock of recognition. It was a moment of pure dignity, kindness offered with no expectation of reward. It was everything the glittering ballroom was not. Then a sharp voice cut through her reverie. "Frances, stop mooning at the window like a half-wit. Lord Merivale is approaching." Lady Henrietta was beside her, her fingers pinching Frances's arm as the heavy scent of jasmine suffocated her. "Smile," she hissed, "and, for God's sake, try to have an opinion on something other than the weather." Frances turned back from the glass. The man and the dog were gone, the mews empty once more, swallowed by darkness. But the image of that profound kindness remained a tiny warm ember in the cold cavern of her evening. It was a secret she kept a world away from the false smiles and brittle laughter of the ballroom. She did not know his name or his story. She only knew that in a world demanding she be seen, he had noticed something small and broken and offered it solace, that she thought was of infinite value. By the next morning, her mother's patience finally broke. The confrontation did not happen in the drawing room, a stage for civilized arguments. Instead, it happened in Frances's own bedchamber, violating her last remaining sanctuary. Lady Henrietta swept in a whirlwind of frustrated ambition, clutching a sheaf of papers like a weapon. She did not bother with pleasantries. "It is done," she announced, her voice tight with a terrible sort of triumph. "I have spoken with Lord Merivale's man of business, and the initial terms are acceptable." Frances sat at her small writing desk, attempting to answer a letter from her aunt. She put down her pen, leaving a dark blot like a tear on the cream paper. "What terms, Mama?" "The only terms that matter." Lady Henrietta slapped the papers down. They were a litany of debts, a cold black-and-white accounting of the ruin creeping up on the Channing family for years. Her father's gambling, his failed investments, her mother's frantic spending. It was all there, a stack of papers heavier than a tombstone. "Lord Merivale has agreed to settle all of it," her mother said, pacing the small room. Every last shilling. Your father will be spared debtor's prison, and we will not be cast into the street. We will be saved." Frances looked at her mother's flushed face and the feverish light in her eyes. Lady Henrietta had the look of a general who had sacrificed an entire battalion to win a minor skirmish. "And the price?" Frances asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The price is a wedding. A very brilliant wedding." Lady Henrietta stopped pacing and loomed over her. "You will be Lady Merivale. You will have more money than you can spend, and more jewels than you can ever wear. You will be a baroness." Is that not what every girl dreams of? Frances looked at the papers then, back at her mother. She thought of Lord Merivale, his damp hands, his small, cruel eyes that stripped a person of dignity, his sneering laugh. He spoke of his horses with more affection than he ever would a wife. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a falling stone. Lady Henrietta blinked. "What did you say?" "I said no. I will not marry him." For a moment her mother looked utterly baffled, as if Frances had suddenly begun speaking in a foreign tongue. Then that bafflement curdled into pure rage. "You will not!" she spat, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You will not! Do you have any idea what you are saying? Do you see these?" She shook the papers in Frances's face. "This is not a game, you foolish girl. This is our survival, your father's freedom, our very place in society. And you would throw it all away because of some childish distaste for a man willing to save us." "He is not saving us," Frances said, finding a quiet strength she did not know she possessed. "He is buying me, and you are selling me." The slap was so sudden and sharp, it was more of a sound than a feeling. At first a loud crack in the tense air. Then the sting bloomed on her cheek, hot and shameful. Frances did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what her mother wanted, a sign of surrender. She simply met her mother's furious gaze. "I will not do it!" Lady Henrietta's face was a mask of fury. "You will," she said, her voice shaking. "You will marry Lord Merivale within the month, or I will see you locked in this room until you beg me for the privilege. You have no choice, Frances. You have never had a choice." She stormed out, locking the door with a sharp metallic click. Frances stood alone, the echo ringing in her ears. Her cheek throbbed. She looked at the papers on her desk, the cold, hard facts of her family's disgrace. Her mother was right. She had no choice. The world had offered her only two paths: marriage to a monster, or a shared descent into poverty and shame. But as she stood there, a third path began to form in her mind, a wild, desperate, unthinkable path. An image came to her unbidden. A man kneeling in the gaslight, offering a piece of bread to a stray dog, an act of quiet decency in a world devoid of it. He was nothing, a laborer or a beggar for all she knew, with no name, no fortune, no standing. He was the absolute antithesis of Lord Merivale. In the eyes of her mother he was less than nothing, and that she realized with dizzying clarity was exactly what she needed. If she had to be owned, she would choose her owner. She would choose a man her mother could never claim as a victory. She would not be sold. She would give herself away for a price of her own choosing. It was not true freedom, but it was defiance, the only thing she had left. She bribed her maid Agnes with a silver locket, the last piece of jewelry that was truly her own. The girl's eyes went wide, but she took it, her loyalty bought with a few shillings of silver and sentiment. The bedroom door was unlocked, an hour after dawn. Frances did not take a carriage. She walked. Pulling a plain woolen shawl over her head, she blended into the grey, anonymous morning crowd of shopgirls and clerks. She did not know his name or where he lived. She had only a fool's hope and a single desperate memory. She returned to the mews behind Lady Danbury's house, a place of damp hay manure and the sharp smell of rain on cobblestone. She began to ask around, her gentle voice and refined accent entirely out of place. She described the man, tall, quite wearing a worn but clean coat. She described the dog. Most people shrugged and turned away, but a stable boy chewing on a piece of straw finally recognized the description. The man recalled Cole, a quiet fellow who did odd jobs and lived over at number 7 Sparrow Street. Even the name of the street sounded poor. It was a narrow, twisting lane of soot-stained brick tenements, the air heavy with coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Number 7 was a grim building with peeling paint and dark, watchful windows. Frances felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was madness. She should turn back, lock herself in her room, and simply accept her fate. But then came the memory of her mother's triumphant face and of Lord Merivale's wet-lipped smile. It pushed her forward. She knocked on the door. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The door opened. It was him, Miles Cole. He looked different in the daylight. The kind theatricality of the gaslight was gone. He was younger than she had imagined, 30 or so, with a lean face made of sharp angles and planes. A dusting of dark stubble lined his jaw. His hair was raven black in desperate need of a trim, and his eyes were a startling shade of sea gray. Cool, assessing, and showing an intelligence that seemed entirely out of place in this neighborhood. He wore a simple collarless shirt and worn trousers smelling faintly of soap and sawdust. Seeing a well-dressed lady on his doorstep did not seem to surprise him. In fact, he showed nothing at all. His expression was a blank canvas. Yes. His voice was low and rough, as if rarely used. In that instant, Frances's carefully rehearsed speech simply evaporated. "I am Miss Channing," she stammered, feeling the sheer foolishness of her errand press down on her. "I saw you the other night with the dog." A flicker of something crossed his gray eyes. Not recognition, but perhaps annoyance. "You gave it bread," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "I saw you from the ballroom window." He said nothing. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Overhead, a child cried from an open window. She took a breath and plunged ahead. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Cole." "I am not for hire," he replied, starting to close the door. "Wait!" she cried, placing a hand against the rough wood. "Please, this is a business arrangement, a marriage." The door stopped moving. He looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. For the first time, a real emotion registered in his eyes, utter disbelief with a faint shade of pity. "You are mad," he said, not unkindly, "or you are in a great deal of trouble. Either way, you have the wrong man." "No," she said, her desperation making her bold. "You are exactly the right man. You are not of my world. That is why it must be you." She fumbled in her reticule and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. "I have 50 pounds. It is all I have, but it is yours if you will marry me today." 50 pounds was a fortune to a man like him, a year of wages or more. She saw the calculation in his eyes as he looked at the pouch. He was no saint then. He was a man with needs. Silence fell between them for a long time. His gaze remained fixed on her face, searching. She felt as though he were reading the entire sorry history of her life, in her eyes the defiance, the terror. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice softer now. "I am being forced to marry a man I despise," she said the truth, raw and unadorned. "A cruel man. If I am already married even to—" She faltered, not wanting to insult him. "Even to a beggar," he finished for her, his voice flat. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a statement of fact. "Yes," she whispered. He looked past her down the grimy street, as if weighing her offer against the entire world. She could not guess his thoughts. Was he thinking of the 50 pounds, of the absurdity of it all, or was he like her, simply thinking of survival? Then his gaze returned to hers, steady and unnervingly clear. "There will be conditions," he said. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. "Anything. This is a transaction," he added. "Nothing more. You will not be my wife in any true sense, and I will not be your husband. We will be strangers who share a name. Is that understood?" "Yes," she breathed. "And the money," he said, his eyes resting on the pouch in her hand. "I will take it, but not for myself. It will be held for you, should you ever need it." This was not what she expected. She had prepared for greed or at least grudging acceptance. This was something else. It was honorable. All right, she said, confused but agreeing. One more thing, he added, his voice hardening slightly. If we do this, you will live as I live. No fine gowns, no carriages, no servants, there will only be this. He gestured vaguely at the dark, narrow hallway behind him. Can you accept that? She thought of her gilded cage, of her mother's suffocating ambition, and of Lord Merivale's grasping hands. She looked at this strange, quiet man with his startling eyes and his inexplicable code of honor. This was not a cage. This was a door to an entirely different world. A terrifying, unknown world, but one of her own choosing. Yes, she said, and this time the word was not a whispered breath. It was firm, certain. I can. He gave a single, sharp nod. Very well, Miss Channing, he said. Let us go and get you married. From his perspective, the girl on his doorstep was a ghost. A ghost from a world he had deliberately, painfully left behind. He had seen her type before in the drawing rooms and ballrooms he now only viewed from the outside, like a pressed flower in a book. A beautiful, brittle thing, preserved but lifeless. But this one was different. There was a crack in her porcelain facade. He had seen it from the mews that night. While the others danced and laughed, she stood at the window. Her expression was one of such profound, quiet sorrow that it struck him like a physical blow. He was not by nature a man given to whimsy, but he had found himself looking for her at that window again, the next night and the next. And now, here she was, Frances Channing, proposing marriage with a bag of coins and desperation in her eyes. His first instinct was to say no, to shut the door and bolt it. Her world was poison. He had spent 2 years carefully excising it from his life, trading the title of Duke for the anonymity of Cole the laborer. He had traded the crushing weight of expectation and memory for the simple, honest ache of physical work. He had found a strange monastic peace in the grime of Sparrow Street. This girl threatened that peace. She was a spark of damask and perfume in his world of coal dust and grit. But he could not shut the door, because he saw the truth of her predicament, in the slight tremor of her hand, in the defiant set of her jaw. He recognized the look of a trapped animal, and he had always had a soft spot for trapped things. The 50 pounds was both an insult and a key. An insult because his fortune could buy and sell her family 1,000 times over. A key because it gave him the perfect excuse. A man like Cole would not refuse 50 pounds. A man like Cole would see it as a windfall, a miracle. To refuse would be to break character, to invite questions he could not answer. There would be conditions, he had said, testing her and testing himself. You will not be my wife in any true sense. This was for him as much as for her. He had a wife once, a ghost of a memory that still haunted the silent halls of his real home. He could not, would not replace her. Not with this girl, not with anyone. This would be a marriage of paper, not of heart. The money will be held for you. This was a matter of principle. He would not take her last pittance. It offended his sense of order. The Duke in him, the man he tried so hard to suppress, would not allow it. You will live as I live. This was the final, most important test. If she was merely a spoiled girl, having a tantrum, this would send her running back to her gilded cage. If she was serious, if she was truly desperate, she would stay. She had stayed. She had said yes. And so Alexander, Duke of Whitchurch, known to the world as Miles Cole, found himself standing in the dusty vestry of a forgotten city church, next to a girl with the eyes of a startled fawn, pledging his false name in a vow that was both a lie and a terrible binding truth. The vicar was old and smelled of damp wool. The only witnesses were a grizzled verger and the hovering spirits of 1,000 forgotten baptisms. The ring was a simple band of brass purchased for a few pennies from a street vendor on the way. It looked absurdly cheap and foreign on her slender, well-manicured hand. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was no joyous kiss, no swell of organ music, only an awkward, cavernous silence. He had just bound himself to a stranger. He had just dragged a girl from the frying pan of her life and dropped her directly into the fire of his own complicated secret one. It was the most reckless, idiotic thing he had ever done. And as he looked at her standing so still and well in the gloom, he felt a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of something he had not felt in years. Responsibility. The rooms on Sparrow Street were cleaner than Francis had expected, but just as sparse. There were two of them, a small sitting room with a table, 2 chairs and a fireplace, and an even smaller bedroom with a narrow bed and a single window facing a brick wall. There were books, though, stacks of them. Not the leather-bound, gold-tooled volumes of her father's library, but worn, well-read paperbacks. Plato, Shakespeare, and a book of poetry by a man named Keats. The reality of her situation settled upon her not as a sudden crash, but as a slow, creeping chill. She had done it. She was Mrs. Cole. This grim little space was her home, and the silent, watchful man who was now her husband was her only companion. The first few days were a study in silence. Miles he had told her to call him. Miles would leave early in the morning before sunrise and return late in the evening tired and covered in dust. He would nod to her, wash his face and hands in cold water, and sit to eat the simple food she made. Francis had never cooked a day in her life. On their first day she had burned the oats to a black smoky crisp. On the second day she nearly sliced her finger off trying to chop a potato. But she learned. She learned from their landlady, a gruff, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, who showed her how to stretch a few pennies, how to make a stew that would last for 3 days, and how to bake a decent loaf of bread. She learned the rhythms of Sparrow Street. She knew Mrs. Gable's son Tommy had a cough that would not stop. She knew the man in the room above theirs played the fiddle sad, lonely tunes that drifted down through the floorboards at night. She knew the children playing in the street, despite their dirty faces and ragged clothes, laughed with a freedom she had never known. And she learned about her husband, not from anything he said, because he said almost nothing, but from what he did. Francis learned that he was incredibly clean, despite his dirty work keeping his few clothes neatly folded and his books arranged in a precise order. She learned that he read every night, his brow furrowed in concentration, while his long fingers traced the lines of text. And she learned that he left a small bowl of milk on the doorstep every evening for a stray cat. It was the same quiet kindness she had first witnessed, just repeated in a different key. He never touched her. He slept on a thin pallet on the floor of the sitting room, leaving the bed in the bedroom for her. He never entered without knocking first. He treated her with a formal, distant courtesy that was more unsettling than any cruelty. He was a locked room, a puzzle to which she had no key. Who was this man? This laborer who read Greek philosophy and showed tenderness to stray animals was clearly no simple beggar. There was a core of steel in him, a quiet authority that had nothing to do with wealth or status. One evening, a week after their wedding, he came home later than usual. He was not just tired, he was tense. There was a new hard line to his mouth. "We are leaving London," he said without preamble. Francis was stirring a pot of soup over the fire. She turned to look at him. "Leaving? Where are we going?" "To the country," he replied. "What part of the country?" she asked. "It is better if you do not know." He looked at her, his sea-gray eyes completely unreadable. "There are complications. People are looking for you, your family." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Her mother. Francis had imagined her mother's fury, but she had never considered that Lady Henriette would actually act, that she would hunt her down. "They want to have the marriage annulled," he said, his voice flat. "They are claiming you were coerced, that you were not of sound mind." "But that is not true," Francis cried. "I chose this. I chose you." The words hung in the air between them. "I chose you." It sounded far more intimate than she had intended. Something shifted in his expression and the hardness softened just for a moment. "I know," he said. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "But they will not believe it. We must go somewhere they cannot find us." She looked around the small, grim room. It had been her prison and her sanctuary for a week. Now, he was asking her to leave it to step out into an even greater unknown. But what choice did she have? Her only anchor in this strange new life was the stranger she had married.
"When do we leave?"
she asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," he replied. That night she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the other room. He was a mystery, a protector, her husband. And she was utterly, terrifyingly in his power. She had fled one cage, only to find herself in another. A cage whose bars were invisible, but whose lock was held by a man she did not know at all. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. They left as they had arrived in the gray, pre-dawn, anonymous and silent. But this time they did not walk. A carriage was waiting at the end of the street. Not a fancy crested carriage, but a sturdy, plain traveling coach with 2 strong horses. Francis stared at it, bewildered. This was an expense far beyond the means of a simple laborer.
"Where did this come from?"
she asked, as Miles handed her in. "A friend," he said, his tone discouraging further questions. The journey took 3 days. They traveled north, leaving the sprawling, smoky stain of London behind them. The city gave way to tidy suburbs, then to rolling green countryside. The air grew cleaner and sweeter, smelling of damp earth and new leaves. Miles was even more silent during the journey, lost in his own thoughts. He stared out the window, but Francis had the sense that he was not seeing the landscape rushing by. He was looking at something far away, something in his past. She did not press him. She was beginning to understand that his silence was a kind of wall, and she did not yet have the right to look over it. She watched him when he thought she was not looking, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark lashes rested against his cheek when he dozed, and the strength in his hands resting on his knee. A man of contradictions and hidden depths. Despite her fear and the uncertainty of her situation, she felt a flicker of something else, curiosity, a deep, unsettling curiosity about the man she had married. On the evening of the 3rd day, the carriage turned off the main road and into a private tree-lined drive. The trees were ancient oaks, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. The drive went on for miles. Francis's bewilderment grew with each passing minute. This was not the approach to a humble country cottage. This was the approach to an estate. Finally, the trees parted, and she saw it. The house. It was too grand to be called a house, sitting on a gentle rise overlooking a lake that shimmered like a sheet of silver in the fading light. It was built of pale, honey-colored stone that seemed to have grown from the land itself. It was vast, with wings that stretched out like welcoming arms, and dozens of windows that glittered like diamonds as they caught the last rays of the sun. It was not merely beautiful, it was magnificent. It breathed power, history, and ancient money. The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance. A set of massive oak doors swung open, and a line of servants appeared, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. An elderly butler, his back ramrod straight, stepped forward. He looked at Miles, still dressed in his laborer's clothes, and then at Francis in her simple woolen dress. But there was no disdain in his eyes, only a deep, profound, and utterly astonished relief. He bowed low. "Your Grace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home, Your Grace." The words echoed in the sudden, profound silence. Francis turned to look at the man beside her, her husband, Miles Cole, the laborer from Sparrow Street. He was not looking at the butler. He was looking at her. His sea-gray eyes filled with a weary resignation, and something else she could not name. Regret, perhaps. "Francis," he said, and his voice was the same low, quiet voice she had come to know. "There is something I must tell you." But he did not need to, she knew. The grand house, the servants, the title. It all clicked into place with a sickening, dizzying lurch. He was not Miles Cole. He had never been Miles Cole. He was a duke, and this magnificent, breathtaking estate was his home. She had not married a beggar. She had married a prince in disguise. And she had never in her entire life felt more like a fool. Alexander felt her shock as a physical thing, a tremor that ran through the carriage. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, followed swiftly by a look of profound betrayal. He deserved it. He had lied to her. Not in words, perhaps, but in every action, every moment of their strange marriage. He had not planned to bring her here to Falconcroft. This house was a mausoleum filled with the ghosts of a life he had run away from. His plan had been to hide her away in a small remote cottage on the estate, keeping her safe until he could figure out what to do. But his business manager in London, the only one who knew of his double life, had sent an urgent message. It was not just her mother. Lord Merivale was a far more dangerous man than Francis knew. He was using his considerable influence, calling in favors and painting a picture of Francis as a hysterical, unstable girl, kidnapped by a charlatan. They were petitioning the courts and hiring men to find her. A simple cottage would not be safe. The only place he could truly protect her was here within the walls of his own fortress. So he had brought her home. And in doing so, he had been forced to kill Miles Cole. "Your Grace, the butler," Hargrove said again, his composure beginning to crack. We had feared the worst. I am well." "Hargrove," Alexander said, his voice taking on a tone of command that Francis had never heard before. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed, the voice of a duke. "This is my wife, the Duchess." He said the words, and they felt foreign on his tongue. The Duchess, this pale, quiet girl in a cheap woolen dress. Hargrove's eyes widened, but his training held. He simply bowed lower. "Your Grace," he said, his voice now directed at Francis. But Francis did not seem to hear him. She stared at Alexander, eyes wide with a raw mix of anger and hurt. "You lied to me," she whispered, a quiet accusation meant only for him. Yes, he admitted the word like a stone in his throat. "We will speak of this later." He turned back to his staff. "See to the Duchess's comfort. She will take the main suite in the east wing." A silent ripple of shock passed among the servants. The east wing had been locked away for 2 years. Alexander helped Francis down from the carriage. Her hand felt cold and stiff in his. She moved like a sleepwalker, her gaze drifting over the grand stone facade, the perfect lawns, and the silent army of servants. She was entirely in shock. He led her inside, stepping into the massive great hall. It was a cavernous space where the ceiling soared 2 stories high, heavy with elaborate plasterwork. Stern portraits of his ancestors, a long line of past dukes of Whitchurch, stared down from the dark walls. The air inside was cold and perfectly still. The house felt as if it had been holding its breath for a very long time. Leaving her with a nervous, fluttering head housemaid, he retreated to the only sanctuary, left to him the library. It was a magnificent space, 2 stories high, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books. It smelled of old leather-sweet beeswax and fading memories. He poured a brandy, his hand shaking slightly as the decanter clinked. He had not touched a drink in 2 years. The fiery liquid hit his throat like a sudden shock. He had made a mess, a terrible, tangled mess. He had dragged this girl into his world, a place she was completely unprepared for, just to solve a crisis in her own. He had done it to protect her, or so he claimed. If he were being honest, there was more to it than that. She had intrigued him with her quiet courage, her bizarre proposition, and those sad, intelligent eyes. He had been so lonely, acting on a sudden impulse for the first time in years. Now, that impulse had a formal title, Duchess, and was being settled into his late wife's bedchamber. The realization sent a sharp jolt of panic through his chest. No, he had not thought this through. He had fled to Sparrow Street to escape. He had gone there to forget. After Eleanor died, the grand title, this house, and the life of the Duke of Whitchurch became an unbearable torment. Every room held a ghost. Every polite word of sympathy from his peers was another turn of the knife. So he vanished. He became Miles Cole, a man with no past, no future, and no expectations. A simple laborer who could lose himself in hard physical work. A man who was blessedly, completely numb. Francis Channing had made him feel something again, and he was not sure whether to be grateful or terrified. A soft knock sounded on the heavy library door. "Come in," he called out, his voice rough. It was Francis. She had not changed her travel dress, but her shawl was gone. She looked incredibly small and lost in the vast book-lined space. "They put me in a bedroom," she said. Her voice was entirely flat. She explained that the room was larger than their whole apartment on Sparrow Street, with a fireplace taller than herself and a marble bath. He said nothing, simply swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with rising emotion. "Why did you lie to me? Who are you?" "My name is Alexander St. John, Duke of Whitchurch," he said, forcing himself to meet her steady gaze. "The lie was my life as Miles Cole. I am truly sorry for the deception. It was never my intention to involve you in this." "Not your intention." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You married me. You bound me to your lie, so what did you think would happen?" "I do not know," he admitted, "and it was the absolute truth. I wanted to protect you, but then everything became complicated." She stepped deeper into the room, her eyes scanning the endless rows of books. "So, this is the real you," she murmured. "The books on Sparrow Street, Plato, Shakespeare. It was not a disguise at all. It was the only true thing about you." He was stunned by her quick perception. "Yes," he quietly agreed. She stopped before his massive desk. She picked up a silver-framed portrait from the wood. It was a miniature of a lovely laughing woman with bright blonde hair and lively blue eyes. "Who is this?" Francis asked. Alexander felt a familiar crushing tightness in his chest. "That was my wife," he said. "Eleanor, the late Duchess." Francis set the portrait down gently and looked at him. For the first time, her anger softened into something else entirely. It was understanding, and perhaps pity. "She died," Francis said, stating it as a simple fact. 2 years ago, he confirmed, in this very house. The silence that followed shifted. It was no longer tense or awkward, but filled with a quiet shared sorrow. She was mourning her lost freedom, and he was mourning the woman he had loved and lost. "The rooms they gave me," Francis said softly. "They belonged to her, did they not?" He flinched under the question. He had not even considered that, having simply ordered the finest rooms prepared. "Yes," he admitted, "but I can have you moved at once." "No." She surprised him by saying, "It is quite all right." She looked around the library again, studying the portraits, the endless shelves, and the heavy velvet drapes. "I think I'm beginning to understand." She met his gaze, her eyes clear and direct. "You were not just running from my family, were you, Your Grace? You were hiding from all of this." He had no answer to give. He could only look at this strange, perceptive girl. He had married the one who had seen right through his disguise, finding the grieving man hidden beneath the Duke. And in that moment he felt the first crack in the ice that had frozen his heart for 2 long years. The days that followed felt like a strange, slow dream. Frances was a duchess now. She had a lady's maid, a shy girl named Lucy, who seemed utterly terrified of her. Her closets were stuffed with gowns belonging to the late Eleanor, vibrant silks and heavy velvets that felt like costumes from someone else's life. She ate her meals alone in a massive dining hall, sitting at one end of a table so long the other side was nearly out of sight. The food was incredible, served on fine porcelain bearing the family crest, but it tasted like dust to her. She missed the simple, lumpy stew she used to cook back on Sparrow Street. Alexander remained a distant, ghostly figure. He was polite and considerate, but completely absent, choosing to eat his meals alone in the library. Sometimes she watched him from her window, a solitary figure pacing the endless manicured lawns, his hands clasped behind his back and his head bowed low. He was like an exiled king in his own land. Falconcroft was her cage now. It was a beautiful prison, but a prison all the same. The servants treated her with a tense, respectful curiosity. To them, she was the mad woman from London, the Beggar Duchess, who had somehow captured their grieving master. She knew the gossip whispered in the servants' quarters, but she did not try to change their minds. What could she possibly say? The truth was far more bizarre than any rumor. Instead of fighting against her new life, She began to explore the estate. With a nervous Lucy trailing close behind, she wandered the endless corridors, letting her fingers brush against the cold, silk-covered walls. She found narrow, hidden staircases, abandoned rooms wrapped in white dust sheets, and a music room with an ancient grand piano that was badly out of tune. The house lay asleep, grieving alongside its master. She found herself drawn to the library. It was the core of the estate and the center of the man who ruled it. He sat there daily, surrounded by leather volumes, as if building a fortress of paper and ink. She never spoke to him. She would simply select a book, a novel by Jane Austen or a volume on foreign travel, and settle into a wingback chair across the hearth. He always looked up when she walked in, a brief flicker of surprise, crossing his gray eyes before a curt nod. Then they would sit together in silence. The only sounds were the quiet turn of a page and the hearth fire. It was a strange, quiet arrangement, but it was companionship nonetheless. She was no longer merely the beggar duchess. She had become a quiet presence in his sanctuary, a silent witness. She asked for nothing and made no attempt to force him to speak. She simply existed. One afternoon she discovered him in the conservatory rather than the library. It was a stunning glass building at the rear of the estate, though it had fallen into complete neglect. The exotic plants were either dead or choked with weeds, and thick dust coated the glass panes. He stood before a withered orange tree, his face completely blank. She loved this room, he said without turning around. He knew it was her. She made it her own, and she could make absolutely anything grow. Frances remained silent. She walked to a table and picked up a pair of rusty shears. Slowly, methodically, she began to snip the dead leaves from a wilting rosebush. He watched her work for a long time. "What are you doing?" he finally asked. "It needs to be done," she replied simply, keeping her eyes on the branches. "If you leave things in the dark for too long, they die. Sometimes you have to let the light in." They both knew she was not just talking about the plants. The next morning she walked down to find the cavernous dining table had been abandoned. Instead, a small table stood in the sunny bay window laid out for two. Alexander was already seated reading the morning paper. He looked up as she entered. "Good morning, Frances," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name without a stiff, formal weight behind it. For a brief second, his mouth softened. Not quite a smile, just the almost. She sat down opposite him as the sun streamed through the window, warm on her face. For the first time since arriving at Falconcroft, the food actually tasted like hope. Then the arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Whitchurch was announced by a flurry of activity and a carriage even grander than the Duke's. Lady Mariella St. John was Alexander's mother, a woman whose reputation preceded her. She was famous in the ton for her sharp wit, her even sharper tongue, and her absolute devotion to her son. Frances dreaded the meeting. She felt like an imposter, a complete fraud. Surely this formidable woman would see right through her and have her thrown out on her ear. Soon she was summoned to the main drawing room, a vast formal space they had not yet used. The dowager stood by the fireplace, a small bird-like woman swathed in elegant black silk. Her eyes, the same startling sea gray as her son's, missed absolutely nothing. Alexander stood stiffly beside her. "Mother," he said, "may I present my wife, Frances, Duchess of Whitchurch?" The dowager's gaze swept over Frances from the top of her plainly styled hair to the tips of her simple slippers. The gown she wore belonged to Eleanor, a pale blue morning dress that hung a little loosely on her frame. So the dowager said, her voice crisp, "You are the girl who married my son in a back-alley church and dragged him out of hiding." Frances's heart sank. "Your Grace," she began, but the dowager waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, spare me the pleasantries. I have had a very long journey, and I am not in the mood for them." She turned to her son. "Leave us, Alexander. I wish to speak to your wife alone." Alexander hesitated, a protective instinct flickering in his eyes. Mother, perhaps, but his mother cut him off, commanding him to go. He went. The room fell silent. The dowager continued to study Frances, her head tilted to one side. "You are not at all what I expected," she said finally. "I am seldom what anyone expects." "Your Grace," Frances replied, her voice quiet but steady. A flicker of amusement showed in the old woman's eyes. "No, I don't suppose you are. The reports from London paint you as either a lunatic or a scheming seductress, but you do not look like either." She gestured to a nearby sofa. "Sit," she commanded. "Tell me everything, and do not even think of lying to me, because I can smell a lie from a mile away." And so Frances told her. She spoke of her mother, of Lord Merivale, and of the desperation that had driven her to Sparrow Street. She told her about the quiet laborer who read Plato and was kind to stray animals. She told her about the sham marriage that had become all too real. She left nothing out. When she was finished, the dowager sat in silence for a long time, staring up at her son's portrait on the mantelpiece. "He has not been home in 2 years," she said softly. "Since Eleanor passed, this house died with her. He died with her. He walled himself up in his grief and refused to see anyone. I thought I had lost him." She turned back to Frances, her sharp eyes suddenly surprising in their gentleness. "He has written to me," she said. "For the first time in 2 years I received a letter from my son. He told me about you. He said you were unexpected." "I am a complication he did not need," Frances said. "Nonsense," the dowager sniffed. "You are exactly what he needed. He was drowning, my dear, and you in your own mad way threw him a lifeline. You have brought him home. You have made him a duke again, whether he likes it or not." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "He is a good man, Frances, my son. But he is a fool when it comes to his own heart. He thinks he is protecting Eleanor's memory by punishing himself. He needs someone to show him that it is all right to live again." She patted Frances's hand. Her fingers were cool and dry like autumn leaves. "You have made a start." The small table at breakfast was a masterstroke. Bringing the library back to life, waking up the conservatory, I have seen the changes. The house is breathing again, all because of you. Tears welled in Frances's eyes, tears of relief and of gratitude. She had found an ally in the most unexpected of places. Now the dowager said, her voice brisk once more. "We have work to do. This business in London will not go away on its own. Your mother and that odious Lord Merivale are making a great deal of noise. We must make more." "What do you mean?" Frances asked. The dowager's eyes gleamed with a familiar, calculating light. It was the same light Frances had seen in her own mother, but this time it was aimed in her defense. "I mean," the dowager said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that it is time for the Duke and Duchess of Whitchurch to be reintroduced to society. We are going to throw a ball, and you, my dear, are going to be the most talked-about woman in London." The decision was made. They would return to London. Not to the grime of Sparrow Street, but to Whitchurch House, the family's palatial city residence that had stood empty for 2 years. Alexander was against it at first. The thought of returning to the London season, of the endless parade of balls and dinners, of the sympathetic, pitying glances, it filled him with cold dread. He had run from that world for a reason. But his mother, with her unassailable logic, and Frances with her quiet, steady presence, wore him down. "You cannot hide forever," Alexander, his mother, had told him. "You are the Duke of Whitchurch. It is not just a title, it is a duty, and your first duty is to your wife. You must protect her name. You must protect your name." He had looked at Frances then. She had not said a single word, but her eyes held a silent plea. She had trusted him. She had placed her life in his hands. And now her reputation, her very future, was being torn to shreds because of the choice she had made, the choice he had allowed her to make. He had a duty to her, a duty that went far beyond the paper contract they had signed in that dusty church. He was her husband. Very well, he had agreed. "We will go to London." The return to the city was a world away from their escape. They traveled in the dowager's crested coach with outriders and a long procession of servants. Whitchurch House was a magnificent mansion on Grosvenor Square. A full staff had been hired, working for a week to prepare it for their arrival. It was another gilded cage, But this one felt different. It was a fortress from which they would launch their campaign. The Dowager was in her element, a general marshalling her troops. Invitations were sent. A date was set for the ball. It would be the event of the season. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of the most powerful, the most influential, and the most gossipy members of the ton. Frances, meanwhile, was subjected to a different kind of battle, the battle of the dressmakers. She was poked, prodded, and measured for a new wardrobe. "You cannot be seen in Eleanor's clothes," the Dowager had declared. "They are not you. You are not a ghost. You are the new Duchess, and you must have your own style." Frances's style, it turned out, was one of quiet elegance. The Dowager, with her keen eye, understood that dressing Frances in the latest, most flamboyant fashions would be a mistake. It would look like a costume. Instead, they chose fabrics of the highest quality in subtle, rich colors, deep emerald sapphire blue and warm, creamy ivory. The cuts were simple, classic, accentuating Frances's slender grace. She was not being remade into someone else. She was simply being revealed. During this time, something shifted between Frances and Alexander. The shared purpose, the impending battle, forged a new kind of intimacy between them. They became co-conspirators. They spent their evenings in the London library, which was smaller and far more intimate than the one at Falconcroft. They would discuss the guest list plan, the menu, and talk. For the first time, they truly talked. He told her about his life before, about his time at Oxford, his travels on the continent, and his love for architecture. He spoke of his father, the previous Duke, who had been a stern and demanding man. And haltingly, he spoke of Eleanor. "We grew up together," he said one night, staring into the fire. "Our families had always intended for us to marry. It was expected." She was vivacious, full of life, and she lit up every room she entered. I loved her. But I am not sure she was ever truly happy here. I think this life, the duties, the expectations, it suffocated her. He fell silent. Frances did not press him. She simply listened, acting as a safe harbor for his words and his memories. "She became ill," he continued, his voice low. "A fever that would not break. The doctors could do nothing. She died in the East Wing at Falconcroft. And I failed her. I could not save her." "It was not your fault," Frances said softly. "Wasn't it?" he asked, his voice raw with a grief that was still so fresh. "I was her husband. I was supposed to protect her." Frances reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was the first time she had initiated any physical contact. His muscles were tense beneath her fingers. He looked at her hand, then up at her face. His sea-gray eyes filled with a storm of emotions. "My mother is right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You are unexpected, Frances." He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to kiss her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted him to. She realized with sudden, shocking clarity that she wanted him to kiss her. But he didn't. He pulled back, a look of conflict on his face. The ghost of Eleanor was still between them. He stood up abruptly. "It is late," he said, his voice once again formal. "You should get some rest." He turned and left the room, leaving Frances alone with the fire and the frantic, hopeful beating of her own heart. A few nights later, as they worked on the seating plan for the ball, she stumbled over his name. "We should place Lord and Lady Ashworth here," she said, pointing to the diagram. "And perhaps the Duke of... Perhaps Miles, your Grace, should sit here." She still did not know what to call him. Your Grace felt too formal. Alexander felt too intimate. Miles was a lie. He looked up from the list he was writing, setting his pen aside. "My name is Alexander," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I would be honored if you would use it." She looked at him, at this man of so many names, so many identities. The beggar, the Duke, the grieving husband, Alexander. "Alexander," she said. The name felt right on her tongue. It was not the name of a duke or a laborer. It was the name of the man she was beginning to know, the man she feared beginning to love. A slow smile touched his lips. A real smile this time, not an almost. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. "Thank you, Francis," he said. And in that moment, in the quiet of the library, with a battle looming before them, they were not a duke and a duchess, or a rich man and a poor girl. They were simply Alexander and Francis, and it was enough. The night of the ball arrived. Whitchurch House was ablaze with light. Music and laughter spilled out into Grosvenor Square. Every carriage in London, it seemed, was lined up outside. Francis stood at the top of the grand staircase, Alexander at her side. She wore the ivory gown. It was simple in its elegance, adorned only with a string of pearls that had been a gift from the dowager. Her hair was swept up, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She did not look like a girl playing dress-up. She looked like a duchess. She was terrified. Her hands were ice-cold. Alexander must have sensed it, because he reached over and took her hand in his. His was warm and steady. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at him. He was magnificent in his formal evening wear, the dark coat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders. The star of a ducal order glittered on his chest. He was every inch the duke. But his eyes, his sea-gray eyes, were fixed on her, and they held not the arrogance of a nobleman, but the quiet concern of a husband. "No," she whispered honestly. He squeezed her hand. "Neither am I," he admitted. "But we will face them together, together." The word was a shield. They descended the staircase. A hush fell over the crowd. Every eye in the room turned to watch them. They saw the lost Duke of Whitchurch returned from his self-imposed exile, and they saw the woman on his arm, the mysterious beggar wife. The dowager was waiting for them at the bottom of the stairs. She beamed. "Perfect," she mouthed. The night became a blur of introductions, of faces, smiling eyes assessing. Francis navigated it with a grace she had not known she possessed. She remembered names, made polite conversation, and smiled until her face ached. Alexander was a constant, steady presence at her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He deflected the impertinent questions, steered her away from the most notorious gossips, and filled her champagne glass when it was empty. They were a team, a united front, and the ton, fickle as it was beginning to be won over. The whispers were changing. She was not a madwoman. She was a mystery, an original. Quiet, yes, but with a certain poise. And the Duke, well, he was clearly besotted. And then they arrived. Francis saw them first. Her mother, Lady Henriette, and Lord Merivale standing in the doorway as if they owned the place. They had not been invited. Lady Henriette was dressed in a gown of garish purple, her face a mask of furious determination. Lord Merivale was at her side, a sneer playing on his lips. They had come for a public confrontation. A wave of nausea washed over Francis. Her carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. She felt Alexander tense beside her. "It is all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "I am here." Lady Henriette spotted them and began to push her way through the crowd, Lord Merivale in her wake. The crowd parted, sensing drama. The music faltered and died. The room fell silent. "Francis," her mother called out, her voice shrill. "Thank God we have found you. We have been so worried." She rushed forward and grabbed Francis's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "My poor darling girl, held captive by this charlatan." She turned to the assembled crowd. "This man," she announced, pointing a trembling finger at Alexander, "is an impostor, a fraud. He tricked my poor impressionable daughter into a sham marriage. He is a common laborer, a beggar who calls himself Cole." A collective gasp went through the room. This was better than a play. Lord Merivale stepped forward. "We are here to take her home," he said, his voice unctuous. "The marriage will be annulled. Lady Francis will be my wife, as was always intended." He reached for Francis's other arm. Frances felt trapped a prize in a tug-of-war between three people who wanted to own her. But then she looked at Alexander. He was perfectly still. His face was a calm, cold mask of aristocratic disdain. He looked down at Lord Merivale's hand on his wife's arm, then back up at the man's face. "Unhand my wife," he said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the silence like a shard of ice. They were a command, not a request. Lord Merivale faltered, his bravado wavering in the face of such cold authority. Your wife, Lady Henrietta, shrieked with laughter. "This man is no duke. He is a nobody. Tell them, Frances. Tell them the truth." All eyes were on Frances. This was the moment. Her mother was offering her an escape, a way back to her old life. All she had to do was denounce the man beside her. She looked at her mother, at her face twisted with desperation and greed. She looked at Lord Merivale, at his cruel, possessive eyes. And then she looked at Alexander, her husband, the man who had shown her kindness when she was invisible, who had given her a way out when she had none. The man who had shared his grief with her, who had let her into the locked rooms of his heart. The man who was standing beside her, now ready to face down the world for her. She had made her choice on Sparrow Street in a moment of desperate defiance. Now she made it again in the heart of London society, in the full glare of 100 pairs of eyes. But this time it was not out of defiance. It was out of love. She gently removed her mother's hand from her arm, stepped away from Lord Merivale, and stepped closer to Alexander, looping her arm through his. "I am sorry, Mama," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the silent ballroom. "But you are mistaken. This is my husband, Alexander St. John, the Duke of Whitchurch, and I am his Duchess." She turned to Alexander and smiled a genuine, radiant smile. "And I have never been happier." The silence was broken by a single sharp sound. The Dowager Duchess, standing nearby, began to applaud. Slowly at first, then with gusto. One by one, others joined in. The Duke and Duchess of Bainbridge, Lady Danbury, the room erupted in applause. The ton had made its decision. They were on the side of the Duke and his mysterious, lovely Duchess. Lady Henriette stared, her mouth agape. Her plan had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to expose a fraud, and had only succeeded in cementing her daughter's place at the very pinnacle of society. She looked not like a concerned mother, but like a mad, jealous shrew. Lord Merivale, ever the opportunist, saw that the tide had turned against him. He mumbled a hasty excuse and vanished into the crowd. Lady Henriette was left alone, isolated in a sea of disapproving faces. Frances looked at her mother, and she felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. She saw a woman who had been so consumed by her own ambition, by her fear of poverty and insignificance, that she had been willing to sell her own daughter. She was not a monster. She was just a small, frightened woman whose world had just collapsed around her. It was a pathetic, lonely end to a lifetime of scheming. Alexander put his arm around Frances's waist and drew her close. "Let us give them something to talk about," he whispered. He led her to the center of the floor, nodding to the musicians who struck up a waltz. And as the entire London society looked on, the Duke and Duchess of Whitchurch danced. For Frances, the room, the music, the people, they all faded away. There was only Alexander, his hand warm and sure at her waist, his sea-gray eyes looking at her with an expression of such open, unguarded love that it took her breath away. "I love you, Frances," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "I think I have from the moment you stood on my doorstep and proposed to a beggar." "I love you, Alexander," she whispered back, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. "My Duke." He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that lit up his entire face, and in the center of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by the ghosts of their past and the promise of their future, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the chaste, formal kiss of a duke and duchess. It was the deep, passionate, and long-overdue kiss of a man and a woman who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, and who were at long last finally home. Epilogue. 6 months later, The autumn sun cast a golden glow over the grounds of Falcon Croft. The trees that lined the lake were a riot of red and gold, their leaves rustling in the crisp, clean air. The house was alive. The windows were thrown wide, letting the warmth of laughter and music spill into the quiet gardens. The grand house was finally breathing again. On the terrace stood Frances, her shoulders draped in a soft woolen shawl, as she watched Alexander. He was down by the water, skipping flat stones across the lake with young Tommy, the landlady's boy from Sparrow Street. After the ball and after her mother had fled to the country in utter disgrace, Frances had absolutely insisted on this. She had brought Mrs. Gable Tommy and the few other kind souls from Sparrow Street here to Falcon Croft. Now Mrs. Gable ruled as head housekeeper, her blunt efficiency terrifying the younger maids. Tommy, his deep cough finally cured by the fresh country air and proper medical care, had grown into a strong, happy boy who idolized the Duke. Just then Alexander looked up and caught her eye. He smiled that effortless, brilliant smile, still so beautifully new, and waved. Frances waved back, her heart swelling. This was not the haunted specter who had wandered these gardens 6 months ago. The heavy shadows had lifted from his eyes, replaced by a deep warmth meant only for her. He had reclaimed his title as Duke, not out of cold duty, but by his own choice. Embracing his position, he now campaigned for real reforms for the poor in the House of Lords, using his influence and his past life as Miles Cole to do genuine good. Of course, he had not forgotten Eleanor. Her portrait still hung in the library, but beside it now rested a new frame, a small, delicate miniature of Frances. The two women, both duchesses in their time, seemed to coexist in quiet peace. The past was never erased, only honored, leaving the present vibrant and alive. Alexander jogged up the grassy slope to join her on the terrace, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin against her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "I was thinking about a man," she replied, leaning back against his warm chest. "A man I once saw from a ballroom window, kneeling in the dirt to give his last piece of bread to a stray dog." He fell silent for a moment. "I was thinking about a girl," he murmured, "a girl who stood on my doorstep and offered me £50 and a chance to feel something again." She turned in his arms to face him.
"You were seen, Alexander,"
she said softly, her hand rising to cup his cheek. "Even in the dark, even when you believed you were completely invisible, I saw you. And you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he mirrored her touch, "you were never invisible to me, Frances. You were the only thing I ever saw." Then he kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with the quiet certainty of their love. It was not a transaction or defiance or an escape. It was a choice, a home, a beginning. And as the sun dipped low over their laughing living house, they stood together, no longer hiding, no longer lost, but simply finally seen. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We would love to know which city you are watching from. Let us know what the story made you feel, and remember to subscribe so you never miss our new stories.